The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of the Charleston Historical Archives as Daniel Crawford carefully placed the photograph on the scanner bed. It was a cabinet card from 1899, donated just last week by the estate of Eleanor Whitmore, a local woman who had died at age 97. The photograph showed two children posed in a studio setting with painted backdrop of draped curtains and classical columns. The girl, approximately 14 years old, stood behind a seated boy who appeared to be around 11. Both wore formal Victorian clothing, the girl in a high-necked dark dress with leg-of-mutton sleeves, the boy in a wool suit with a stiff white collar. Their faces were solemn, as was typical for photographs of that era, when subjects had to remain perfectly still for long exposures. Daniel had been working as chief archivist at the Charleston Historical Society for 8 years, and he had digitized thousands of 19th century photographs. This one seemed unremarkable at first glance, just another formal sibling portrait from the Gilded Age. But something about it drew his attention, made him pause before moving on to the next item in the donation box. The girl's hand rested on the boy's shoulder in what appeared to be a protective gesture. Her expression was intense, her dark eyes staring directly into the camera lens with an unsettling focus. The boy's face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. His hands were folded in his lap, but there was a tension in his posture that seemed wrong somehow, as if he were holding himself rigidly upright through sheer will. Daniel initiated the high-resolution scan, watching as the machine's light bar moved slowly across the photograph. The archives had recently upgraded their equipment, capable of capturing details at a resolution far beyond what the human eye could discern in the original print. It was this technology that had helped them discover hidden details in historical photographs, faded inscriptions, background figures previously unnoticed, subtle expressions that revealed untold stories. As the image appeared on his monitor, Daniel zoomed in, examining the photograph section by section as part of his standard documentation process. He noted the studio's name embossed at the bottom: Hartwell and Sons Portrait Studio, Charleston, SC. The date, April 1899, was written in faded ink on the back. He zoomed in on the children's faces, preparing to note their features in the catalog description. That's when he saw it, something in the folds of the girl's dress that made his breath catch in his throat. His hand trembled slightly as he adjusted the zoom level, bringing the detail into sharper focus. There, partially concealed in the dark fabric gathered at her waist, was a small glass bottle. And the boy's hand, the positioning he had thought was simply Victorian formality, showed fingers slightly curled in what looked disturbingly like a spasm. His lips, upon closer examination, had a faint bluish tint around the edges. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. Something was very wrong with this photograph. Daniel's hands moved quickly across the keyboard, searching the archive's database for any information about the children in the photograph. The donation records from Eleanor Whitmore's estate included a handwritten note, yellowed with age, that had been tucked behind the photograph in its frame. Margaret and Samuel. April 1899. God rest his soul, Samuel. Past tense. Daniel's instincts had been correct. Something tragic had happened to the boy. He pulled up the Charleston death records from 1899, scrolling through the digital scans until he found it. Samuel Harrison Mitchell, age 11 years, died April 23rd, 1899. Cause of death, fever, sudden onset. Attending physician, Dr. Horace Pemberton. Buried, Magnolia Cemetery, April 23rd, 1899. April 24th, 1899. If the photograph was taken in April 1899, as the inscription indicated, it meant Samuel had died shortly after, perhaps within days of this portrait being taken. Daniel zoomed in again on the boy's face, studying his pallor, the subtle wrongness in his expression. Had he already been dying when this photograph was taken? Daniel searched for more information about the Mitchell family. Census records from 1900 showed a household at 47 Church Street. Robert Mitchell, age 42, occupation listed as cotton merchant. Caroline Mitchell, age 38, listed as his wife. And Margaret Mitchell, age 15. No Samuel. He had died the year before the census was taken. But Daniel noticed something else. Robert Mitchell was listed as Margaret's stepfather, and the 1890 census showed Caroline as a widow with 2 children, Margaret and Samuel, living with her parents. So Caroline had remarried sometime between 1890 and 1900, bringing her 2 children into Robert Mitchell's household. Daniel knew that blended families in the Victorian era often faced challenges, and stepchildren were sometimes treated poorly, especially if the new husband resented the financial burden or saw them as reminders of his wife's previous marriage. He continued searching and found a brief obituary in the Charleston News and Courier from April 22, 1899. Died suddenly, Samuel Harrison Mitchell, beloved son of Mrs. Caroline Mitchell, age 11 years. The boy was taken ill with violent fever on Thursday evening and expired Friday morning despite the efforts of Dr. Pemberton. He is survived by his mother and sister. Funeral services will be held at St. Philip's Episcopal Church. Violent fever. Sudden onset. Daniel had read enough Victorian death records to know these phrases were often euphemisms, vague descriptions used when the true cause of death was unclear, suspicious, or socially unacceptable to state plainly. In an era before modern toxicology and autopsy procedures, poisoning often went undetected or unreported. He pulled the photograph back up, zooming in on the glass bottle in Margaret's dress. It was small, perhaps 2 inches tall, with a cork stopper, the type commonly used for medicines, tonics, and other substances in the 1890s. Laudanum, morphine, arsenic-based compounds, and dozens of other toxic substances were readily available at any pharmacy, often sold without questions or restrictions. Daniel needed to know more about Margaret. What had happened to her after her brother died? And why had she been holding that bottle in the photograph? Daniel spent the next 2 days following Margaret Mitchell's life through public records, piecing together her story from fragments scattered across more than a century. What he found painted a picture of a girl whose life had been shaped by tragedy long before that photograph was taken. Margaret Rose Harrison was born in 1885 to Caroline and Thomas Harrison. Her father, a bank clerk, died in 1888 when Margaret was just 3 years old, killed in a streetcar accident on Broad Street. Samuel had been born in 1887, making him 2 years younger than Margaret. Caroline, suddenly widowed with 2 small children and limited means, had moved back in with her parents for 2 years before marrying Robert Mitchell in 1890. Robert Mitchell was a successful cotton merchant, a man of some wealth and social standing in Charleston. The marriage should have provided security and stability for Caroline and her children, but Daniel found hints that suggested otherwise. He discovered a letter in the archive's manuscript collection, part of a correspondence donated years ago by a different family. The letter, dated 1895, was written by a woman named Abigail Thornton to her sister in Columbia. "I saw Caroline Mitchell at church last Sunday, and she looked so thin and worn, poor thing. They say her husband is a difficult man, very strict with those children, especially the boy. Mrs. Dawson told me she heard shouting from their house one evening when she walked past. Terrible, frightening shouting. But of course, one doesn't interfere in such matters. One doesn't interfere." Daniel felt a familiar anger rising in his chest. How many tragedies could have been prevented if Victorian society hadn't been so committed to the privacy of the home, to the absolute authority of the patriarch, to the silence that surrounded family violence? He searched for more references to the Mitchell household and found scattered mentions in society pages, church bulletins, and business directories. Robert Mitchell appeared frequently, serving on boards, attending civic functions, conducting business. Caroline appeared occasionally at ladies' charitable events. The children were rarely mentioned at all. Daniel found one more crucial document, a school record from Crafts Academy for Young Ladies, where Margaret had been enrolled from 1895 to 1898. The headmistress had noted in Margaret's file, "Intelligent and capable student, but often distracted and anxious. Frequently asks to be excused from class, claiming headaches. Shows signs of exhaustion. Mother reports the girl is of a nervous disposition. Recommend she be given lighter assignments." Between the lines, Daniel could read what the headmistress hadn't written explicitly. Margaret was a traumatized child, stressed and fearful, and the adults around her had dismissed it as feminine weakness, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of abuse. He turned back to the photograph, looking at Margaret's face with new understanding. That protective hand on Samuel's shoulder wasn't just a pose arranged by the photographer. It was real. Margaret had been protecting her little brother however she could. And when protection was no longer possible, when the violence became unbearable, she had made an unthinkable choice. Daniel knew he needed to find Margaret's own words, her own testimony. Somewhere in the historical record, there had to be more. Daniel's next stop was the South Carolina Historical Society's medical archives, housed in a climate-controlled facility on Meeting Street. Dr. Horace Pemberton, who had signed Samuel's death certificate, had been a prominent Charleston physician for over 40 years. Upon his death in 1923, his case notes and correspondence had been donated to the archives, hundreds of pages documenting the medical realities of Charleston's upper class during the Gilded Age. It took Daniel 3 hours to locate the relevant file, but when he found it, his hands shook as he carefully opened the leather-bound journal to April 1899. Dr. Pemberton's handwriting was cramped and difficult to read, but Daniel worked through it slowly, transcribing each entry. April 18th, 1899. Called to Mitchell residence, 47 Church Street. The boy Samuel, complaining of severe stomach pain and vomiting, administered bismuth and laudanum. Symptoms consistent with gastric distress, possibly from spoiled food. Advised bland diet and rest. Mother very concerned. Will visit again tomorrow. April 19th, 1899. Returned to Mitchell residence. Boy's condition deteriorated overnight, now showing tremors, profuse sweating, dilated pupils. Very unusual progression for a simple gastric upset. Symptoms troubling. Reminded me of cases I observed during my training where patients had ingested certain toxic substances. Questioned mother and stepfather about possibility of accidental poisoning, household cleaners, rat poison, etc. both adamant nothing of the sort in the home. Stepfather became quite angry at suggestion, accused me of impugning his household management. I administered morphine for pain. Boy drifting in and out of consciousness. April 25th, 1899. Samuel's condition critical. Seizures began this morning. Pulse weak and irregular. Cannot eat or drink. Sister Margaret, in hysterics, had to be removed from the room by mother. Girl kept saying, I'm sorry, repeatedly. Mother sedated daughter with valerian drops. Consulted with Dr. Barnwell. He agrees symptoms are highly unusual for typical childhood fever. We discussed the possibility of toxicology consultation, but stepfather refused, said he would not have his family subjected to such indignity and scandal. Boy unlikely to survive the night. April 21st, 1899. Samuel Harrison Mitchell expired at 6:47 this morning. Death certificate completed. Listed cause as fever, sudden onset, per family's wishes. Mr. Mitchell made it quite clear he expects discretion and that no further investigation should be pursued. For the sake of the surviving family members, especially the grieving mother and sister, I have agreed. But I have deep misgivings. The progression of symptoms was consistent with acute poisoning, possibly arsenic, possibly strychnine, possibly one of the alkaloid compounds. The girl's behavior particularly concerns me. She has not left her room since the boy died, and the mother reports she will not eat or speak. Daniel sat back, his eyes burning. Dr. Pemberton had known. He had suspected poisoning, but had been pressured into silence by Robert Mitchell's wealth and social position. The death certificate was a lie, a cover-up enabled by a system that valued reputation over truth. And Margaret, 16 years old, traumatized, locked in her room, unable to eat or speak. Whether from grief or guilt or both, Daniel couldn't yet tell. Daniel needed to understand the timing more precisely. If the photograph was taken in April 1899, as indicated, was it before Samuel fell ill or after? The answer might reveal whether Margaret had already begun poisoning her brother when they posed for this portrait, or whether this had been taken earlier and the bottle was unrelated. He returned to the photograph, examining it more carefully. Hartwell & Sons Portrait Studio had been one of Charleston's premier photography establishments in the 1890s. Daniel knew that the studio's business records had been preserved when the building was demolished in 1962. They were now part of the archives collection. He located the studio's appointment book for 1899, a large leather-bound ledger with entries written in careful script. Flipping to April, he found it. April 17th, 1899, Mitchell family, 47 Church Street. 2 children, sibling portrait. Special request, expedited processing, prints to be ready by April the 20th, April 17th. That was the day before Dr. Pemberton's first house call to treat Samuel. But the notation expedited processing was unusual. Normally, photographs took several weeks to develop and print. Someone had paid extra for rush service. Why? Daniel found another document in the studio's files, a handwritten note, preserved because it had been tucked into the ledger. It was addressed to Mr. Hartwell from a Miss M. Mitchell, and read, Dear Sir, I must have the photographs of my brother and myself completed as quickly as possible. It is urgent. I am enclosing extra payment for your fastest service. Please do not mention this correspondence to my parents. The portraits are to be a surprise. Margaret had arranged the photographic session herself in secret and had paid for expedited service. She had known, or at least suspected, that time was running out. This wasn't a routine family portrait. It was Margaret creating a final record of herself and Samuel together before she carried out her terrible plan. Daniel found one more piece of evidence in the studio files. A note from Charles Hartwell, Jr., the photographer who had actually taken the portrait, written to his father. The Mitchell sitting was unusual and rather unsettling. The girl was very specific about the positioning. She insisted on standing behind the boy with her hand on his shoulder, said it must be exactly that way. The boy seemed unwell, very pale and quiet. He had difficulty sitting upright, and I had to use a posing stand behind him to help him maintain position during the exposure. The girl watched him constantly with the most intense expression I've ever seen on a child's face. When I suggested we might reschedule when the boy was feeling better, she became quite agitated and insisted it must be done that day. There was something desperate about her demeanor. I've photographed hundreds of families over the years, Father, and I've never felt quite so uncomfortable during a session. Samuel had already been unwell during the photograph. Margaret had already begun poisoning him. This portrait documented not just their relationship, but the crime itself. The girl standing behind her brother, holding the instrument of his death concealed in her dress, her expression a mixture of love and terrible resolution. Daniel knew he needed to find out what happened to Margaret after Samuel's death. Had she been discovered? Had anyone suspected her involvement? Or had she carried the secret to her own grave? He searched for Margaret Mitchell in records from 1900 onward, and found that her trail became difficult to follow. She was listed in the 1900 census at age 15, still living at 47 Church Street. But then she seemed to vanish from Charleston records entirely. No marriage record, no death certificate, no property transfers, nothing. Then Daniel found a notation in the Episcopal Diocese records. Margaret Rose Mitchell. Age 16, entered St. Catherine's Home for Troubled Girls, Columbia, South Carolina, May 1899. St. Catherine's Home. Daniel knew of it. It had been an institution run by Episcopal nuns for wayward girls and young women deemed mentally unstable, socially unacceptable, or otherwise in need of containment and reform. It had closed in 1932, and its records had been sealed for decades before finally being transferred to the state archives. Daniel made the drive to Columbia the next morning, his mind racing with possibilities. At the state archives, he requested the St. Catherine's admission records. When the boxes arrived, he worked through them systematically until he found Margaret's file. Inside was an admission form dated May 3rd, 1899, just 2 weeks after Samuel's death. It was signed by Robert Mitchell and Dr. Pemberton. The reason for admission was listed as severe nervous disorder following death of brother. Melancholia, refuses food, makes concerning statements, requires supervision and moral guidance. Attached to the admission form was a letter from Robert Mitchell to the Mother Superior of St. Catherine's. My stepdaughter has become unmanageable following her brother's tragic death. She makes wild accusations and disturbing statements that reflect a diseased mind. For her own welfare and that of the family, she requires a structured environment where she can receive proper spiritual and medical attention. I trust she will remain in your care until such time as she demonstrates improvement and can be returned to society. Wild accusations. Disturbing statements. Margaret had tried to tell someone what happened, and she had been institutionalized for it, but the most devastating document in the file was a diary, written in Margaret's own hand during her first months at St. Catherine's. The nuns had confiscated it in August 1899, and it had remained in her file ever since. Daniel's hands trembled as he began to read, Margaret's voice reaching across 125 years. May 10th, 1899. They have brought me to this place and locked the door. I tried to tell Mother what Father Mitchell did to Samuel, how he beat him so terribly, how Samuel cried every night from the pain. I tried to explain why I had to help Samuel escape the only way I could, but Mother wouldn't listen. She called Dr. Pemberton, and they both agreed I was suffering from hysteria and delusions. Father Mitchell told them I had always been a difficult, imaginative child prone to lying. And now I am here, locked away with women who scream in the night. Daniel continued reading Margaret's diary, each entry more heartbreaking than the last. The pages were stained and worn, some entries barely legible where tears had smudged the ink. But Margaret's voice was clear, desperate, and devastatingly honest. On May 15th, 1899, I dream about Samuel every night. I see his face when he understood what I had done, that last morning before he became too sick to speak. He asked me if I had put something in his food. I couldn't lie to him. Samuel always knew when I was lying. I told him yes. I told him I couldn't watch Father Mitchell hurt him anymore. Samuel cried, but he also hugged me and said he understood. He said he was tired of being afraid. He said maybe heaven would be better than our house. He was 11 years old and he wanted to die. What kind of world makes a child feel that way? Daniel had to stop reading and walk away, his vision blurred with tears. He stood in the archives hallway, struggling to breathe, trying to process the magnitude of what Margaret had endured. She had been a 14-year-old girl, trapped in a house with a violent stepfather, watching her younger brother being systematically brutalized, and she had seen no other way to save him. When he returned to the diary, he forced himself to continue. May 22, 1899. The nuns here are not unkind, but they do not understand. They pray with me and tell me that Samuel's death was God's will, that I must accept it and move forward. They don't know that I chose it, that I measured out the arsenic I stole from Father Mitchell's warehouse into Samuel's food over 3 days. They don't know that I held him while he died and told him I loved him. They think I am mad with grief. Perhaps I am, but I would do it again. Samuel suffered for years under Father Mitchell's fists, and Mother did nothing because she was too afraid of being widowed again, of losing the house and the money. I could not save him by any other means. I tried. God knows I tried everything else first. June 8th, 1899. I asked the Mother Superior today if I could write to my mother. She said letters are a privilege that must be earned through good behavior and spiritual improvement. But what I want to tell Mother cannot be written in any letter they would allow me to send. I want to tell her that she chose her security over her children's safety. I want to tell her that I heard Samuel crying through the walls at night after Father Mitchell beat him. I want to tell her that the morning after Father Mitchell broke Samuel's arm, and she told everyone Samuel had fallen from a tree, I went to the pharmacy and bought arsenic, telling the clerk it was for rats in our cellar. I want to tell her that I am not sorry. The diary continued through the summer of 1899, documenting Margaret's daily life at St. Catherine's. The prayers, the chores, the other troubled girls who shared her confinement, but the entries grew shorter, more detached, as if Margaret were slowly retreating from the world. August 3rd, 1899. They are talking about keeping me here permanently. Father Mitchell visited today and spoke with Mother Superior. I could not hear everything, but I heard him say that I am dangerous and unstable and should remain institutionalized for everyone's safety. He is afraid I will tell someone what he did. He is right to be afraid. That was the last entry. The diary ended there, confiscated by the nuns who deemed it evidence of Margaret's continued mental disturbance. Daniel searched through the rest of Margaret's file at St. Catherine's, looking for what happened to her after the diary was taken. What he found was a series of institutional reports, cold and clinical, documenting the slow erasure of a traumatized girl. The reports, written by the attending physician Dr. Ernest Blackwell, described Margaret's mental state in the language of Victorian psychiatry. Patient exhibits signs of moral insanity and feminine hysteria. Shows no remorse for disturbed thoughts regarding deceased brother. Continues to make unfounded accusations against stepfather. Treatment: cold water therapy, enforced silence during meals, isolation when agitated, spiritual counseling. Cold water therapy, enforced silence, isolation. Daniel knew these were euphemisms for torture. Girls and women at institutions like St. Catherine's were subjected to ice baths, locked in small rooms for days, denied food, and treated as if mental illness or trauma were moral failings that could be corrected through punishment and prayer. A report from November 1899, patient has become more compliant, no longer voices disturbing accusations, participates in daily prayers and chores without resistance. However, patient rarely speaks voluntarily and shows flat affect. Recommend continued supervision. Margaret had learned to be silent. She had learned that telling the truth brought only more suffering, so she had retreated inward, becoming the docile, broken girl the institution wanted her to be. Daniel found one letter in the file, dated December 1899, from Caroline Mitchell to Mother Superior. I write to inquire about my daughter Margaret's condition and when she might be able to return home. The holidays are approaching, and despite everything, she is still my child. I have enclosed a small monetary contribution to the home for her continued care. The Mother Superior's reply was attached. Dear Mrs. Mitchell, I regret to inform you that Margaret is not yet ready to rejoin society. Her moral and mental condition remains fragile. Dr. Blackwell advises that she requires at least another year of treatment and spiritual guidance. Your contribution is gratefully received and will be used for Margaret's benefit. Another year, and then another. Margaret remained at St. Catherine's for 7 years. Daniel found her discharge papers dated April 1906. She was 21 years old, legally an adult, and could no longer be held without her consent. The final report stated, patient being discharged to her own recognizance, has shown significant improvement in behavior and deportment, no longer exhibits previous disturbed thinking, has secured employment as a domestic servant through the home's placement service. Mother Superior confident patient, can function adequately in supervised environment. Domestic servant. Margaret, intelligent and educated, had been released from 7 years of institutionalization, only to become a maid in someone else's household. It was the only future available to a woman who had been institutionalized, her reputation destroyed, her family unwilling to take her back, her youth stolen. Daniel traced Margaret's life after St. Catherine's through census records and city directories. She worked as a domestic servant in Columbia until 1910, then disappeared from South Carolina records entirely. He finally found her in Charleston again in 1915, listed as Margaret Mitchell, seamstress, boarding house, East Bay Street. She had come back to Charleston, back to the city where Samuel died. Daniel wondered why. Was it an attempt to reclaim something of her past, or simply that she had nowhere else to go? Daniel found Margaret's death certificate dated January 1954. She had died at age 68 in a charity ward at Roper Hospital in Charleston. Cause of death, pneumonia. No surviving family listed. She had lived alone, worked as a seamstress her entire adult life, and died in poverty surrounded by strangers. But there was one more document Daniel needed to find. Eleanor Whitmore, who had donated the photograph, had been born in 1927. She couldn't have known Margaret personally when she was young, but perhaps she had known her in later years. Daniel searched for any connection between Eleanor Whitmore and Margaret Mitchell. He found it in the Charleston City Directory from 1948. Margaret Mitchell and Eleanor Whitmore had lived in the same boarding house on Church Street, just blocks from where Margaret had lived as a child with Samuel and her family. They had been neighbors for 6 years. Daniel contacted Eleanor Whitmore's executor, who was still settling the estate. Did Miss Whitmore leave any personal papers, letters, or journals? He asked. Particularly anything that might mention a Margaret Mitchell? The executor called him back 3 days later. I found something. Miss Whitmore kept journals her entire adult life. In the volumes from the late 1940s and early 1950s, she mentions Margaret frequently. Would you like to see them? Daniel drove to the executor's office immediately. The journals were leather-bound volumes, Eleanor's neat handwriting filling page after page. He found the first reference to Margaret in March 1948. There is a woman who lives down the hall from me, Miss Margaret Mitchell. She must be in her 60s, very thin and quiet, works as a seamstress from her room. She never speaks to anyone unless directly addressed. But yesterday I met her in the hallway when we were both carrying groceries, and she smiled at me, such a sad, gentle smile. I asked if she needed help with her packages, and she said, "You're very kind, but I've been carrying burdens alone for a long time." Something about the way she said it made me think there was a story there. Eleanor had befriended Margaret slowly over the months, bringing her tea, asking her about her work, sitting with her during evening hours when the boarding house was quiet. Margaret had gradually opened up, telling Eleanor fragments of her history. January 1950. Margaret told me something extraordinary tonight. We were sitting in her room. She had made tea and we were watching the rain, and she suddenly said, "I killed my brother when I was 14 years old." Just like that, as if commenting on the weather. I didn't know what to say. She must have seen my shock because she quickly added, "You probably think I'm mad." Everyone did. They locked me away for 7 years because I told the truth. Then she told me the whole story. About Samuel, about the stepfather who beat him, about the poison, about the institution. She showed me a photograph she's kept all these years, hidden in a book. It was her and her brother, taken the week before he died. She said, "I wanted one last picture of us together. I wanted proof that he existed, that someone loved him." I held her hand and we both cried. Daniel's hands shook as he read Eleanor's account of Margaret's confession. This was the testimony that had been silenced for 50 years, finally spoken aloud to someone who believed. Eleanor's journals continued documenting her friendship with Margaret through the early 1950s. The entries painted a portrait of a woman who had lived her entire adult life carrying the weight of what she had done and why she had done it, unable to tell anyone, unable to be understood. March 1951. Margaret asked me today if I thought she was a murderer. I told her honestly that I didn't know how to answer that question. What she did was kill her brother. That's inarguable. But the circumstances, the desperation, the complete absence of any other option for a 14-year-old girl trying to protect a child from ongoing brutality, how do we judge that? She said, "I've had 52 years to think about it, and I still don't know if I did the right thing. All I know is that Samuel isn't being hurt anymore. And some nights, that's enough to let me sleep." November 1952. Margaret is becoming frailer. She coughs terribly and refuses to see a doctor. She told me tonight that she's kept that photograph of her and Samuel all these years, hidden away, because it's the only evidence that Samuel existed at all. There's no gravestone. Her stepfather had him buried in an unmarked grave. There are no other photographs, no belongings, nothing. She said, "When I die, I want someone to know about him. I want someone to know that he was real, that he mattered, that someone loved him enough to do a terrible thing so he wouldn't suffer anymore." She asked me to keep the photograph after she's gone, to make sure Samuel isn't completely forgotten. January 1954. Margaret is in the hospital. I visited her today and she barely recognized me. The pneumonia has taken hold and the doctors say there's nothing more they can do. She whispered something to me before I left. "Tell them I'm sorry. I'll tell them I tried everything else first." I don't know who she means by them, the world, God, Samuel herself, but I promised I would tell her story if I ever got the chance. Eleanor Whitmore had kept that promise. She had preserved the photograph, had written about Margaret in her journals, and had ensured that when she died, all of it would be donated to the Charleston Historical Archives. She had created the record that Margaret had desperately wanted, proof that Samuel had existed, that he had been loved, and that the terrible choice his sister made had been born from love, not cruelty. Daniel sat in his office at the archives, surrounded by documents, staring at the photograph of Margaret and Samuel. He understood now what he was looking at, not just a portrait of two children, but a document of desperate love, systemic failure, and the impossible choices trauma forces on the vulnerable. He wrote a comprehensive report documenting everything he had discovered. The evidence of Robert Mitchell's abuse, Dr. Pemberton's suspicions, Margaret's confession in her diary, her years of institutionalization, and Eleanor's testimony. He published it in the Journal of Southern History with the photograph prominently featured, titled "Hidden in Plain Sight, Child Abuse, Mercy Killing, and Institutional Silence in Gilded Age Charleston." The article sparked intense debate. Some argued Margaret was a murderer who should have been prosecuted. Others argued she was a victim herself, a child forced into an unthinkable decision by adults who failed to protect her and her brother. Domestic violence advocates used the case to illustrate how systems continue to fail vulnerable children, how silence enables abuse, and how trauma creates impossible moral situations. The photograph was placed on permanent display at the Charleston Museum with a full explanatory plaque telling Margaret and Samuel's story. Visitors stood before it, studying Margaret's protective hand on Samuel's shoulder, the bottle concealed in her dress, Samuel's pale face and rigid posture. What had once seemed like a simple Victorian sibling portrait was now understood as something far more complex. A final act of love preserved in silver and light, a sister's desperate attempt to save her brother the only way she knew how. Daniel arranged for Samuel to finally have a proper gravestone, funded by donations from people moved by the story. It was placed in Magnolia Cemetery with a simple inscription: Samuel Harrison Mitchell, 1887-1899, beloved brother. You are remembered. The zoom had revealed what Margaret was holding, not just a bottle of poison, but the terrible weight of a choice no child should ever have to make. And in revealing it, Daniel had given voice to 2 children whose suffering had been silenced by a society that refused to see, refused to intervene, refused to protect the most vulnerable. The photograph that seemed to show a simple sibling bond in 1899 now told its full truth. A story of love, twisted by trauma, of desperate protection, and of the countless children throughout history whose silent suffering has been overlooked, dismissed, and forgotten until someone finally pays attention to what has been hidden in plain sight all along.